The Chinese theater of World War II was one of the war's deadliest conflicts and saw the Japanese occupy vast swaths of Chinese soil. However, Japanese expansion into China actually has a long history of its own, predating World War II by over 50 years. But in those 50 years, how much of China did Japan actually occupy? In the late 19th century, as China declined in the face of internal and external struggles, Japan was on the rise. The stunning victory of Japan in the Sino-Japanese War of 1894 confirmed what the world had long suspected, that China was no longer the premier power in the Pacific. With this victory, Japan, the former tributary state to the Chinese Empire, followed the example of the Western powers and claimed territory from China. Japan forced China to sign a humiliating treaty which ceded Taiwan, the Penghu Islands, and the Liaodong Peninsula to the Japanese Empire. This was the beginning, but far from the end of the Japanese conquest of China. In the years following the First Sino-Japanese War, China continued to be weakened by internal instability. The fall of the Qing Empire in 1911 was soon followed by the Warlord era, a time where central authority in China ceased to exist. Primary in this struggle were the Chinese nationalists led by Chiang Kai-shek and the communists led by Mao Zedong. As the two Chinese parties exchanged blows, Japan saw its chance for conquest, and in the 1931 Mukden incident created a staged explosion as a pretext to invade Manchuria and establish a puppet regime, naming it Manchukuo. From 1931 to 1937, guerrilla warfare and skirmishes were common between the Japanese and Chinese, but few large-scale engagements took place. That all changed in July of 1937. The Marco Polo Bridge incident began as a misunderstanding between Chinese and Japanese forces, followed by a small exchange of fire. Although both units' commanders apologized, reinforcements were called in from both sides, tensions escalated, and within a week, war had begun in earnest. Hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers flowed into northern China, quickly pushing nationalist forces back, leaving only communist insurgents remaining. Beijing and Tianjin soon fell to the Japanese armies as they continued marching southwards. Although the nationalists took a determined stand at Shanghai, that city too soon fell to the onslaught of the Japanese military. The Japanese continued on, pillaging as they went, committing the Nanjing Massacre as well as many other atrocities. Much like the Eastern Front in Europe, the Chinese theater was a war of extermination. By the beginning of 1938, Japan had extended its territory from the north of China into Shanghai, Nanjing, Suzhou, and Wuhan, but was unable to effectively control large parts of the Chinese countryside. Stuck in a stalemate on the Chinese mainland, Japan turned towards the sea, conquering islands and spreading throughout the Pacific. Once World War II began in earnest, Japan began consolidating their gains in the south of China, taking both Chinese and foreign-administered cities, including Canton, Xiamen, and Hong Kong. However, the Japanese were once again unable to advance into the southern countryside. This brutal stalemate in the south lasted for the majority of World War II, until Japan took drastic action and launched Operation Ichigo in April of 1944. Driving 500,000 men straight through the Chinese lines and advancing all the way to the border of French Indochina, the Japanese were able to cut China in two. While pockets of communist resistance continued to exist behind Japanese lines, the conclusion of Operation Ichigo nonetheless represented the zenith of Japanese territorial control in China. Nevertheless, this Japanese success wouldn't last long. In 1945, with Soviet troops invading Manchuria and the United States detonating nuclear bombs over major cities, the Japanese were forced to sue for peace. 51 years after it began, Japan's conquest of China was finally at an end.